Hello, folks. Welcome back to World War II TV and the last show before a 3-day break before we start again on Sunday. And today we are off to Romania, which is my second show about Romania. Luke Truxell, you may remember, in Strategic Bombing Week, talked about the aerial bombing. But that, as far as activities on the ground, this is our first look at Romania. So that's quite exciting. And I hope you're enjoying the kind of the random nature of the shows we got coming at you. It's interesting because it's keeping my grey cells working because I'm leaping from theatre to subject over from night to night, but it's good. It keeps me busy. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce my guest tonight. So Dr. Grant Harward is in the States and California, I believe, and a professional historian. So Grant, tell us a little bit about what you've been doing recently, where you're working, and how you became interested in Romanian campaign.
Well, I'm actually in San Antonio I work at Fort Sam Houston.
Okay, I got that wrong.
That's fine. I mentioned California in our discussions. That's where I'm from. That's where I was born. And I work with the U.S. Army U.S. Army Medical Department Center of History and Heritage. And just to start off, I got to give a little disclaimer that the views and information presented in this are my own and do not represent the official position of the U.S. Army, the Department of Defense, or the U.S. government. Now, with that out of the way, yeah. So I've been able to find a way to become a working historian for the U.S. Army. I'm a research historian. I work with several others, and so I've been fortunate to get assigned to this area and learning a lot about medical history, which is just fascinating. But my training and my original research was in Romania during the Second World War. Well, modern European history in general. My dissertation was on the Romanian army and its motivation, and out from that grew my book that's coming out in a few months.
And as always, folks, the link to the book is in the description below. The link to Grant on Twitter is in the description below. So I urge people to go out there and find out more about this this area of the war, which I have to confess, folks, I was just saying to Grant before we're going, like, the two shows I like doing are the ones where I know a lot about a subject, so anything Normandy related or paratroopers commandos, or the ones I know nothing about, like tonight, where I can hand over to the guests. The difficult ones for me are the ones where I know a bit about a subject, where I wonder whether the bit I know is actually nonsense or whether it's actually correct. So tonight, I know nothing. What I know about Romania in World War II, I could literally write on the back of a postage stamp. So it's all just me nodding along and asking you questions to clarify things for the audience today. So I won't have many opinions. So I'll hand over to you, Grant. As usual, you provided a PowerPoint presentation, which will start. We've got a couple of clips, folks, to show you of events in Odessa. So I'll hand over to you. And as usual, Grant, when I have questions I want to ask or something from a viewer, I will jump in. So over to you then.
All right, thanks. To begin with, I want to give some context because, like you're saying, a lot of people won't know very much about it. So we can move to the next slide. We can talk about why Romania is in this thing. So Romania, they declare a holy war. That's what the propaganda presents it as, and a lot of Romanians themselves really believe this. You're motivated by nationalism to regain territory that was taken from them by the Soviets a year prior, in June, July of 1940. They're also motivated by religion, anti-Semitism, anti-communism, and even there was a large fascist movement in Romania in the 1930s. And although it was suppressed by a military regime under General Ioan Antonescu, and his military regime is in control, it's a more authoritarian rather than fascist regime. A lot of those fascists are still around. They're now in uniform. Some are in the government. They've been made their peace with Antonescu. And I think this example of propaganda, I really love it. That's why I put it here as the first thing that you could see of the, and you can see this is actually a depiction of the Eastern Front, where those shaded spots on the bottom and top, that's the Black Sea and the Baltic Sea. And so then you have, Romanian and German soldiers, a Romanian and a German soldier advancing against this dragon. It says defeating the Bolshevik dragon. You have this Hydra-like dragon, right? And you see in the end of the tail there is a Star of David, and it's wearing those typical Bolshevik caps. So this myth of Judeo-Bolshevism is important to remember. It's not just It's a worldview that oriented Romanian soldiers. It's going to play a fairly big role in the anti-partisan fight in Odessa and elsewhere on the front, although we're not going to talk about that. But so, yeah, their goals are to regain territory, take revenge for wounded honor, which they blame on both the Red Army and also local Jews, and destroy. They have this idea that alongside the German army, they can destroy this threat that's been looming over them since World War I, right, for 2 decades. And they're even going to seize new territory, right? Odessa is part of Ukraine, and they're going to annex this. And so part of these operations are to secure this territory for themselves. And I think it's important to point out that Romania declares war and commits troops the very first day of Operation Barbarossa, right? Italy declares war, but has no troops there for months. Finland, Hungary, they wait 5-6 days before declaring war. They wait for a Soviet provocation, right? The Romanians are in this hook, line, and sinker, very enthusiastic for the very beginning.
But just to clarify this, Grant, so they have this self-interest view. It's not that they are alongside the Third Reich, and other countries have been pressed into service with the Third Reich. In this case, Romania kind of is seeing itself as its own autonomy. They're looking for their own self-interest. So the moment the Third Reich is I suppose, helping them in their own ambitions. Is that a fair way to say?
Yes, I mean they see themselves as a willing ally, right? There's some Romanians that are a bit angry because northern Transylvania had been given to Hungary a year earlier, but there's this idea that Nazi Germany is now the power broker of Europe, and if they get in this war, not only can they win territory, defeat Bolshevism, they can regain the territory in the east that had been lost, Bessarabia and northern Bukovina. They also thought that by showing that they contributed more than Hungary, that Nazi Germany would give them back northern Transylvania, and then maybe they even get this new territory, Transnistria. They could be an even bigger power. So, some Romanians do have some hurt feelings still, and it's going to come back later in the war about the German and Italians, kind of forcing Romania to give up some territory in 1940 to Hungary. But overall, Romanians see the bigger threat, right? Hungary, this is a threat for tomorrow. This is for the next year after the war's over, right? But we got to get in this war, help Germany defeat this Jewish communist enemy, right? The bigger, more terrible enemy. And they think it's going to be a kind of a cakewalk, right? That the German army is invincible, and they're not. So Romania willingly gets involved in all this.
Cool. Okay.
So just a little bit of orientation here. So I want to show kind of the sphere of operations right here on the southern front of Operation Barbarossa. The Romanians, they contribute 2 armies. Third Army with that travels alongside 11th Army. That's and that's and helps with the destroying the Uman pocket, and then goes further east. So we're not going to really talk about them, but there's another army out there further south, right? So they're supporting the German 11th Army, and then on south there's Romanian 4th Army. This is Third Army has its best units. They've got a mountain corps, a cavalry corps. They've got the most heavy artillery. They've actually assigned a lot of the really good Romanian artillery to German 11th Army to boost it up, and even the Romanian Armored Division, although it will get diverted to Odessa. So but the best stuff all goes to the Germans and Third Army. Fourth Army is kind of the remains of the Romanian Army. It's kind of second tier. They aren't as well equipped, not as well trained. Heavy infantry. They have a border division, which is kind of more effective, and they have a guards division, and so they are sent to Odessa, and they really get embroiled there. And we're going to talk a little bit about that in the next slide. But I just want to show you, here's Romania. Those are the territories that were lost a year prior, right? So you have northern Transylvania that is gone over to Hungary, but then that other shaded area is northern Bukovina and Bessarabia. That's what was occupied by the Soviet Union. That's what they're now liberating, and then going past, right? Immediately going into the Soviet Union, and eventually on the 30th of August, 1941, in the middle of the siege, there's this kind of agreement that's nailed out in Tigina, which is a small city on the Dniester River. And so the Germans come together with the Romanians and decide to give them Transnistria. Now, this solves a problem because Romanians, they've been ethnically cleansing Jews from Bessarabia and Bukovina. And so they've actually been trying to push Jews, Romanian Jews, across the Dniester, right? And so, because they had this idea, that they've been, Antonescu had talked to Hitler saying, we're going to push the Jews across the Urals. So the Romanians are like, hey, we're going to win this war. Here, we're going to get rid of our Jews right now. The Germans, right, they don't want their rear area cluttered in their minds with these dangerous fifth columnists. And so part of this is, Antonescu makes a land grab, and then Hitler solves a problem saying, hey, you can use this area as like a dumping ground for Jews, but Romanians also have this idea of annexing it possibly. And there are ethnic Romanian minorities, Soviet Romanians living there. So there's the idea of turning this into kind of a new part of Romania as well. So if we can move to the next slide, we'll talk a little bit more.
Let's jump in again, Grant, and
Sure.
because the title of your book, A Holy War, and I remember Luke Truxell saying in the show about the bombing of Romania how fundamental that was, understanding how religious a society Romania is and how this all buys into identity and their missions, and they say you brought up anti-Semitism, the fear of Bolshevism, the fear of communism, and when you look at the countries in this part of Europe, Romania is probably the most religious of these countries. Would you agree with that?
Well, Catholics are plenty. Polish people are plenty Catholic. There's really religious people in Eastern Europe. But there was a high degree of religiosity in Romania, even compared to, like, let's say Serbia or Bulgaria, some of the other Orthodox nations. There is a very high religiosity. And even that's among the peasants, who still make up about 85% of the population. And then even the more secular or like irreligious Romanian elites, they might not, be as like religious or church going, but they still think religion is important to their identity, right? They might go to church twice a year, but defending their religion is part of their identity. So that is definitely wrapped up in this. So even though they might have been more secular, this idea of holy war and liberating holy Romanian territory and redemption of Romania, all those kind of Christian imagery resonated even with, the more secular, middle class. And
so they're buying into the ideology, even if they're not completely buying into the traditional religious side of it. It's all tied up with their national identity, who they see as themselves as individuals, who they see themselves as a country, where they sit in their place in Europe. It's all a kind of a potent and therefore quite dangerous package, I guess.
Oh yeah, these things really build off of each other, and especially when you add in the myth of Judeo-Bolshevism, right? Like, anti-Semitism is terrible on its own, right? Anti-communism, right, is a legitimate, even though it can go too far. But then you put those things together, right, and it just kind of supercharges they just have an affinity for each other. It really can drive people to do some really terrible things, and the Romanians really unleash that. It's encouraged, it's spontaneous, and it's also encouraged from above, right? Soldiers are committing atrocities, and then also the state is promoting ethnic cleansing and going to order massacres and things like that, as we'll see.
And I'll let you get back and discuss the slide now. I'm sorry for asking so many questions. I'm just trying.
Oh, sure, yeah.
Keep myself. I'm assuming that some of the viewers are like me. They need a bit of kind of their hand being held walk through this, because it is a little bit of an unknown arena. As most people joining in the sidebar say, I know nothing about this. It's all new to me, Colin, Brian. So I think baby steps to begin with, and we can get into detail a bit later on. But I'll hand back to you.
Right. So the Battle of Odessa is kind of overlooked and often kind of just chalked up to like, oh, the Romanians just kind of screwed around down there. They're outclassed XYZ. But I'm really excited to kind of talk a little bit about it. I can't get too much in detail because we're talking about stuff after the battle. But in the left upper corner, this is Nicolae Ciuperca. He's the general in charge of Fourth Army, and he's been tasked, right, to seize the port as quick as possible, right? And there's it's called the Soviet Independent Coastal Army, and this turns out to be a really tough nut to crack. There's not too many Soviet troops and Marines being, fighting as infantry, but they have a lot of coastal artillery that they can simply turn around and use as, heavy guns. They also have naval guns, right? They have ships in the port or ships that come from Sevastopol, right? It's only about a day's, I think they can get there overnight. So they'll do like runs. So they actually, like, as long as they control the port, they can resupply, they can bring in reinforcements, and they can also bring in, heavy naval guns. Whereas the Romanians, because they've given a lot of their heavy artillery, their best stuff, to Third Army, the German 11th Army, they're equipped with like 75 millimeter French World War I era guns. And we know, everyone loves the French Second, the French 75, however you say it in French. But everyone also knows on the Western Front that it was terrible at getting people out of trenches, right? Well, it's going to have the same problems here, right? The Soviets have built, there's 3 main lines, but that kind of is a misnomer. They've dug tons and tons of trenches, right? They've had time to do this. So there's these lines that they have all these fortifications with concrete, including trenches, and they have backed by heavy artillery. They have the advantage of being resupplied by sea relatively quickly, short interior lines, right? You have, and all these things mean that even though the Romanians outnumber them, I think 2, sometimes almost 3 to 1, it's really bloody and difficult going. The Romanian army is going to suffer 90,000 casualties in 2 months. About a third of those are fatal. So Ciuperca actually about a little more than halfway through the battle, he gets relieved. Officially, it's because for his health. Unofficially, privately, it's because he says that he has like a lack of, will to win, that he's a defeatist. And I think it's kind of a bit of both. I think watching his army kind of get ground down in this battle kind of maybe ruined his health. But at the same time, his last order before going back to Romania is telling the soldiers, we're at the edge, get the gates of Odessa, one last push, we'll take this. Once we take this, it's going to assure that our territory in Bessarabia is ours forever and help contribute to the destruction of Bolshevism. So there's a few things going on there, but this battle is really bloody and really intense. And this is going to lead to some terrible things that happen after the battle once the city is occupied. So let's move forward. All right, so here's some images of the city after its fall, right? The Soviets actually, because Crimea is being threatened and the Perekop Isthmus has been pierced, they withdraw the Soviet Independent Coastal Army and many civilians from Odessa. And because of their superiority in guns, aircraft also coming from Crimea, an unsinkable aircraft carrier, the Romanians aren't able to halt this. But there is some, the Soviets do lose a ton of material. They do lose thousands of men left behind. It's not as clean of an evacuation as is sometimes presented. But you can see here they have barricades. They hadn't even thought about fighting, street to street, for the last days there. And so you can imagine these soldiers are exhausted. A lot of them are angry. They've lost buddies. They're coming into this city, right, that looks like, the French Revolution, right? There's barricades everywhere. And they've been told by their propaganda this is a nest of Bolsheviks, right? And Odessa has a long history of being a major Jewish city, a center of Jewish population. I think something like a third or or more of the city is Jewish. So the propaganda is also telling them these Jews in Odessa, these Jewish communists, they're the ones who are really like pushing the Soviets to keep fighting, right? They're putting a gun at the back of the neck of the Russian infantrymen. There's like a Jewish death squad that's, going around Odessa shooting anybody who's wanting to retreat. So as these guys come in, they've heard these stories in propaganda, and that's not even counting what they've heard like rumors, right? About, the Jewish Bolsheviks that could be hiding out there. And we're going to see there is an actual legitimate threat of partisans, but this is completely merged in the Romanian viewpoint because of this myth of Judeo-Bolshevism. They equate Jews, all Jews are partisans. All Jews are radical, fanatical communists and can't be trusted. The reverse, all partisans are Jews, isn't quite as true. They understand there's, Russians and others who are in the partisan movement, but every Jew is seen as a communist, as a provocateur, as a fifth columnist, as they walk hesitantly into the city that they've taken possession of. All right, so let's go to the next slide.
Well, this is a bit of film, isn't it? This is a bit of film that gives us an idea, a little bit of the sort of setting the scene. I'll play it. It's just silent, folks.
What they're talking about in this film, I listened to the narration. These are like, there's entrances to catacombs underneath in some of these places. And you can see some of the destruction left by, the bombing of Axis planes. They're also blaming the destruction on partisans, saying that the partisans, were sabotaging the city and destroying warehouses and even trying to cover up some of their hideouts, the entrances to the catacombs. And there's some truth to this. There probably was some purposeful demolition by the Soviets to hide where these partisan groups are going to be. Definitely purposeful destruction of like anything useful to the Romanians. And there are the days after the city seized, there are suspicious fires and other things like that. Although this could also be blamed because of just an incendiary that's been dropped that's still burning, or troops, because the Romanian soldiers start looting like crazy, and they go on. They're called sugar patrols, kind of colloquially by locals after the fact. Like, oh, they came on sugar patrols looking for food, but also alcohol. And so drunk Romanian soldiers could be causing some of the stuff that's attributed to partisans. But after talking about this kind of imagined threat of every Jew being a partisan, let's talk a little bit about the actual partisan movement in Odessa, the reality, rather than this myth, this fear of the Romanians. So there is a partisan movement. It's declared, by Stalin, I think in July, that you should organize a guerrilla warfare behind the front. But there's two parts of this. Right now, and the majority of the partisan movement right now is basically a bunch of soldiers cut off, right, in Belarus or Ukraine, right? They're stuck behind enemy lines, but they haven't actually been captured yet, so they still have weapons, right? They're kind of meandering around trying to get east or not get captured. It's very disorganized. It's not really like a partisan movement. On the other hand, there is a growing number of NKVD partisan groups. So the NKVD is the Soviet secret police, right? So these are kind of actually organized, diehard, guys with some have at least some training. You have some photos here. These are the Romanians took these photographs with captured partisans later, showing kind of what these NKVD groups look like underground. And so these guys decide very quickly, we're going to use the catacombs, right, underneath the city. There's this a natural catacombs underneath there. It's a limestone, but also was used as a quarry for scores of years. So there's all these passages, both natural and cut by man, something like 1,400 kilometers. There's 1,000+ openings, and the history of use by criminals right during the Tsarist era, and then even during the Soviet era. There's this tradition that criminals would use them to like hide out in or store, stolen goods in for smuggling. Right on the border of Romania, right? So there's a lot of smuggling going on, and so these organized NKVD groups, especially in Odessa, they're actually like fairly well put together. They probably aren't very well trained. They're probably more chosen because of party loyalty than anything, but they at least have weapons, ammunition, food. Water is fairly plentiful. They had like wells. Fuel was the big thing that they could run out of, because without light, you couldn't navigate. You couldn't have, without fuel, you couldn't be heated. It actually gets very cool under this ground. It's very damp and dank. So the fuel oil for their lamps was like their most valued thing, probably even more so than weapons, but especially by the end. In addition to the literally underground partisan NKVD groups, there is above ground, right, underground resistance formed from raycoms and obcom. Now, com is short for committee. Ray or ob is for rayon or oblast, which is like a region or county. So the raycoms, right, these are regional committees or county committees, right?
Okay.
And so so there's probably about like at least 200, 300 these guys, 200, 300 like partisans underground. And then these raycoms and obcoms, these are groups kind of formed for intelligence purposes, right? They're going to live in Odessa. They're going to support the guys underground in the catacombs, bringing them food, bringing them information, helping them get out, move around the city, that kind of stuff, right? So they're supposed to be mutually reinforcing. And so the mission of these guys is to resist until liberation, right? Run a guerrilla, warfare resistance in the city, and they estimate this to be like 6 months. That's how long they think that it's going to take before the Red Army's back.
I just want to jump in there now, because this ties in with what we were talking about with the French resistance with Chris Millington last week. Is so often in World War II, the ability to resist is not based on your determination. It's based simply on the geography of what you have around you, in that have you got somewhere you can operate from? And you look at the areas of real strong resistance, like in Massif Central in France or in certain parts of Yugoslavia, it's because you've got somewhere to kind of congregate, gather, put weapons and actually work from. And I think the catacombs in this case give that advantage. I also like the idea of the people above ground. They may not necessarily be running around with a weapon, but they are still resisting, and they're there to provide information for those who are underground, who are doing the more in-your-face aggressive job. And this plays on this idea we discussed last week of exactly what is resistance and exactly what is standing by and doing nothing, because resistance comes as a loaded word with this idea of being an armed resistance. But in this case, you're actually kind of breaking these two into separate kind of labeled groups. There's the underground, and then there's the overground underground, in a weird
exactly
way. But that's I find fascinating. And just while we're talking about Romanians, have the Germans themselves, the Third Reich, are they there in any kind of presence in Odessa as well with the Romanians? Because this is the late 41. This is the beginning of the Third Reich's realization that they're not going to just be facing armies; they're going to be facing underground units. You're getting the same thing, other parts of their expanding empire. So, and this is where the anti-partisan badge gets created, that kind of thing. So, what's the Third Reich? How are they watching this, or are they actively participating in this?
So they're mainly observers. So there is a German presence. So, but Fourth Army was tasked with this because the Germans didn't have anybody else. They simply didn't have enough troops, and they realized Odessa is a big danger, right, in their rear. And the only people they had was the Romanians, right? After 2 months of combat, after about a month and a half, the Romanians are actually asking the Germans, like, hey, we need help. And the Germans can only scrounge up, I think it's 5, maybe 6 battalions of like combat engineers and like heavy artillery. Like that's all they can send. Like the German Air Force has sent most of its stuff east to support German 11th Army. German 11th Army with Romanian help is still like it's fighting on the Azov Sea. It's like trying to get into Crimea. It's like going back and forth, right? There is I failed to mention, but I think I listed it. There's Einsatz Gruppe D, like that's this SS group that's assigned to the Romanians.
You mentioned it back there. Yeah.
Right.
And
Army
we talked
group
about that with whatever it was with Joachim Bieler, the German historian, about those groups are doing in Poland. So these are the in a nutshell, these are the German SS people that are very, very good at putting down insurgents and controlling I mean, look at what happened in Poland, controlling recently occupied territory. So these people have a bit of a track record, I guess, of what to do in this sort of situation. I'm just kind of getting an idea of how the team makeup is there, and because you don't necessarily have to have many Germans in Odessa to have, for those that are there, to have an influence, because it's all about what the Romanians, what the Germans, what the partisans have experienced, and who is good at providing knowledge to aid the situation, whether you're on the side of the Third Reich or the partisans, because the Germans are getting some experience at knowing how to try and quash things before they build up.
Yeah, the Einsatzgruppe D, right? It's specifically supposed to be basically shooting Jews and communists.
Yeah.
Not all Jews yet. Either like they want to shoot like party members and that kind of stuff. But there isn't. But most of that is also elsewhere. There is an Einsatzkommando, like a special command of like. It's small, like 2, 3, 4, like SS guys in Odessa. The Tagina Agreement also granted the Germans control, at least temporarily, of transportation network, right? So there's some German sailors that show up to help restore the port. So and they're helping run the trains through the rest of Transnistria. So there's a small German contingent, but they're so busy with other things and so few on the ground. The Romanians, because they signed the Tagina Agreement, they actually have claim on the city, right? That whole territory is all there now, including Odessa and everything in it, pretty much. There's some
I'm just thinking,
debates
Grant, about this idea that we discussed when we were talking about these groups in Poland of a small group of men who are there specifically for, as you say, they're killing Jews, resistors. It legitimizes what can later happen in terms of atrocities. If there's someone there who are kind of turning up like it's their day-to-day job, we put down resistance units all the time. It's our job, and they're kind of blasé about it. It gives the Romanian army this idea that this is a legitimate way to wage war, because your average trained infantryman, whether they're Romanian, Russian, German, British, or American, isn't trained in anti-terrorist, anti-resistance kind of tactics. They're not trained how to shoot people in the back of the head, how to burn out buildings. It's not part of regular military training. But if you've got a small force of SS people there who have been doing this for a year and a half, or ahead of this, or are part, not maybe personally, but a part of a greater organization for whom this is a normal way to wage war, it's legitimizing cruelty. It's legitimizing atrocities. I'm just trying to get some context there into it, because it's leading up to some, as you'll get to, and I will let you get back to your talk, to some horrific stuff that comes up later.
And that's very true, but at the same time, there is the important point to point out that while the SS at this time are saying we're going to shoot certain Jews and communists, the Romanians are actually more likely to shoot any and all Jews. Soldiers, aren't trained to do this thing, but they've actually done a lot of ethnic cleansing. They murder tens of thousands of Jews, mostly men, because they can justify it, right? Even they are not, but they are also shooting women and children in northern Bukovina and Bessarabia, right? So the Romanians themselves, and there's some early where the Germans were like, oh my gosh, the Romanians are just shooting everybody. And there's an argument that the SS, because they start out with relatively limited orders, that when they see Romanians in liberated territory, or Estonians in the Baltics, or Lithuanians who really get on board with murdering Jews in like Vilna and other areas, right? Or even some Poles, right? That then the Germans are like, hey, like these locals are doing these big pogroms. Why don't we just expand this? Why don't we, instead of targeting just like dangerous like Jewish communists?
It's escalated things. If both participants are both doing this as a valid, legitimate thing, they're urging each other on. It's pushing things on. It's basically pouring fuel on fire. We've got another short clip here, folks. This is of weapons. I'll let very short this one. So what's going on this one, Grant?
So they're like, these are captured weapons. This is, typewriter, showing that, the communication, foodstuffs, there's caviar. So this is, showing kind of the reality. There are actually armed partisans in the catacombs, but they number in the hundreds, right? They're a danger, but they're not going to be like, a significant threat. But if you're Romanians, you link that to the tens of thousands of Jews that live in the city. And you see them as like in league. So moving on. So once the city's taken, they set up Odessa military command under this individual in the middle, General Ionel Gogojanu. He's the 10th Infantry Division commander. And then he's kind of given a dual-hatted role as also the Odessa military command. And so he's actually on the outskirts of the city, right? There's like, but they're like, you need to move in. Like soldiers are looting stuff. We think that there's, partisans and like, in the city, like you need an order. So he's eventually going to move into the city. And during this time, there are about 7,000 people who are arrested as partisans, some of whom being shot, not all. But for example, on the 21st of October, there's a Jewish ringleader, right? And 15 communist terrorists were shot, right? So it's like in their mind, like the Jew has to be the ringleader, right? And then we're going to murder. And you can see these three photos in the middle. I'm not sure what period of time this is from. I think it's from this period just because of how many soldiers and how many men who are being captured are being shot. But they're bringing in captives, lining them up. You have the firing squad, and then they're executing them, right? So, from the very first days, there are, soldiers are kind of individually murdering Jews. We'll get to this photo in a second. But there's also these, there's 4,000 Jews who are arrested, right? In addition to those 7,000 suspicious, Russians. And they're not all murdered. Like a lot of them are let go, some of them. Others are like kept in jail and like kind of like preventative arrest. Like, oh, we need to keep these guys, right? At the same time, they capture one of the head of the kind of above ground resistance, Alexander Pavlovich Petrevsky. I don't have a photo of him, but he was caught on the 5th day of the occupation, on the 21st of October, a day before a really terrible thing happens, right? But he was in charge of the Obkom, right, the Oblast committee, and he kind of knew all the names, knew all the players, knew what was going on, and he gets captured on the 21st. Then on the 22nd, Gogojanu has finally moved into the city, and he moves into a building that was the former headquarters of the NKVD, right downtown. I'm not sure why they chose this building, probably because it was nice, which is probably the same reason why the NKVD chose it.
Best one in town.
They've checked it, right? They've sent in Romanian pioneers, and German engineers, right? It's been checked 3 times, but there's locals who are telling them the NKVD mined that building before they left. You should not occupy it. But the Romanians search it, a German unit searches it. They don't find any and so Gogojanu is just like, these are just rumors. They have to, they literally like evacuate, like you have a bomb scare at like, your work. Yep. Right? They evacuate the building, they stand around like, all right, like there's no bomb, go back in, and then the building, it blows up. And it kills Gogojanu 73 other soldiers, wounding 43 more, and another 13 people are missing. There's a few German officers, some Romanian civilians who were like be setting up a new government, occupation government. This photo on the upper right is a plaque of marking the site today. The building, of course, is gone. I can't remember. I think it's like a theater or something. But this is a plaque in Odessa that I took a photo of, talking about, the 22nd of October, this building was blown up. So they're celebrating this act of resistance. Unfortunately, this act of resistance triggers a massacre of Jews by the Romanian authorities. They're also killing a few locals who are deemed communists, but overall, they start. They gather Jews who have already been captured, already been arrested, right? And they start shooting them in the downtown near the port, which is just it's down the street from where this explosion was. So like the smoke from this and rescue operations are ongoing, and they start shooting Jews. And then over out on the outskirts of town is the prison, which is overflowing with Jews. They start marching some of them out and machine gunning them using trenches that have been dug as mass graves, improvised mass graves. They then that takes too long. They take a bunch of thousands of Jews, men and women and children, and shove them into these warehouses in the artillery district, kind of near the train station, and they set them on fire. And then anyone who tries to get out, they machine gun, throw grenades at. Now, the numbers on this, I believe it's about 12,000 Jewish victims. The Einsatzkommando, the SS report about 10,000. I think if you add in, some of who were murdered in the days preceding this, you're going to have about 12,000 Jewish victims. And then there's about 40,000 of the Jews are immediately expelled. They're going to be sent to camps. And then the remaining 40,000 they don't have time to expel are shoved into a ghetto in another part, in the industrial part of town. So right off the bat, you have this, massive shock to the Soviets, right? They have this great kind of victory. We killed the leader of the Romanian, military government, basically. But then you have this massive reaction against innocent civilians in the city. And really interesting, Petrovsky, right, who they just captured, he's released the next day after this, right? One day after this 2-day massacre, and he has signed an agreement to work for the Romanians, right? So one has to wonder, like, this guy hears and sees what's going on. They're telling him, like, we're going to kill you. Look what we're doing to all your other Jewish communist partisan friends. He claims, they release him, and he claims to the rest of the resistance that he's actually feeding them disinformation, that, he's not really collaborating. He's being a double agent, but he won't turn over like the details. He's, the agreed upon plan was if your cover was blown, you're then supposed to turn over leadership to somebody else and give up the information you had. And he refused to do that. So it's likely that he was working as a double agent for the Romanians. And as one historian recently wrote about this, thus began a pattern of ubiquitous betrayal, dereliction of duty, greed, and incompetence. Those are the words of Vladimir Solinari, who talks more at length about the above ground resistance in Odessa.
Wow.
So this is the context, right, that we're getting into of this catacomb fight. And now we're going to kind of get into this the gas operations. Let's move here. So after the fall of Odessa, Fourth Army is actually mostly demobilized, and Third Army takes over. It becomes an administrative unit. It's no longer controlling operations with German 11th Army. It's running any Romanian units from like Transnistria, the Dniester, all the way to Ukraine to like the Don River. And so there are partisans, right? Here are some of the photos that the Romanians are taking of the partisans, and there are enough there in Odessa to operate to cause concerns. There are reports of blown up trains, more fires, things like that. On the 13th of November, so this the photos here are of the entrances. The upper right, on the right hand, both of those are possible entrances, and the building on the bottom left is like there's an entrance in the basement there on Dolnitskaya Street, right? And this is a NKVD group, about 18 people under Alexander Soldantenko. And so they figure out that there's some partisans in there, and the Romanians try to go in, and they get shot at. And so they kind of pull back and decide to how are we going to do this? Kind of think it out. Unfortunately for these partisans, this catacomb was blind because there was all the entrances the Romanians identify and block up and seal. So Soldantenko, he enforces iron discipline. There are people in there who want to, if not surrender, they want to at least try to escape and get into the city and just kind of hey, we're done with this whole partisan thing, or at least get out of these catacombs, right? You can see there's a Romanian pioneer team there with pump equipment. They're trying to pump out water to try to figure out another way in. So the Romanians are up there, they know the Romanians are coming after them, but he enforces kind of very strict discipline with even shoots one person as a panic monger. Eventually, the food starts running low, and they execute a husband and wife who weren't party members to be butchered for food. And this guy is eventually then killed in turn and possibly eaten in turn. And that's the photo of him and his they call her a concubine, which kind of just means girlfriend. In the middle there, the bottom, those are the corpses of they says the cadavers of Soldatenko and his concubine.
And folks, this is on record as the first mention of cannibalism on World War II TV, an area that I guess those watching did not think that this was going to turn this way, but this is an element of this story, that this is a desperate situation. And it's shocking, but history can often be shocking. So important to confront it and understand it. So absolutely amazing stuff.
And it's well attested. It doesn't seem that this was just manufactured after the fact. There was enough of the survivors to say this is what happened. This is how they survived. Other groups were more or less successful. One group was just abandoned by their contact above ground. Eventually, she gets turned by the Romanians, and when she comes down to try to hey guys, you should come up. It's safe now. They're like, nah, we don't believe you. You got to come down here. And so she goes down, and they execute her, and they refuse to leave, but they remain bottled up. Other groups find ways to dig new exits or to burrow through to another gallery, another
passage. I mean, if there's 1,400 kilometers of tunnels there, I guess you're never that far away from another passage somewhere. But you're below ground. You haven't got excavating tools and things like that, and breaking through is difficult, and it's rock. But people watching this, they may be a little bit familiar with the Warsaw Uprising, which of course was going on this week. 77 years ago, but I think most people, myself included, did not have much knowledge about what was going on in Odessa. So this is, I love the fact that on World War II TV we are tackling subjects that just don't really get covered elsewhere, because as gruesome and horrific as some of this stuff is, it's important to learn about.
Yeah, and we'll come back to this cannibal group and kind of pick up their story. But let's move forward and kind of talk a little bit more about these Romanian efforts and what's going on. So really importantly, there's a winter crisis right on the front. And this is going to be kind of the instigating factor of why they bring in this smoke unit, the smoke company. The Soviet winter counteroffensive starts on the 5th of December. at Moscow. It starts on Christmas Eve, right in Crimea, which is when it really, already alarm bells are ringing, and then you have Crimea get attacked too. That really like puts the Romanians on edge because they think, hey, if the Soviets can land troops across, into Romania, into Crimea, they could come to Transnistria and land here. And we've still got 40,000, Jews and these partisans underground, right? But so far, they're mostly trying to use intelligence, like informers, and blocking up entrances to deal with this problem. You have Section 2. This is the name for Army intelligence. You have the SSI, the Serviciu Secret Informații, the the Secret Intelligence Service, and military police, or municipal police. So all these people are kind of involved in this. But because of this threat, they decide to liquidate the ghetto. And on the 24th of December, right, the general staff has already issued orders for the smoke company to be sent to Odessa, right? So instead of just taking these kind of passive measures of blocking up and watching and trying to catch maybe who's ever, can be informed upon, we're also going to take kind of offensive action to try to root these guys out by literally smoking them out with this special company. But then over the beginning and the end of they decide also that they're going to take the Romanian Jews and deport them, right? And the other Jews have already been, a lot of them have already been massacred. I'm not going to get into that, but they're going to liquidate this ghetto and send them in further into Transnistria, where the SS, German militiamen from local ethnic Germans and Ukrainian police and Romanian gendarmes are killing Jews, executing them. And then the rest are, in ghettos who are starving cold, right? You just have photos here of partisans who've been hung and also Jews who've been massacred elsewhere, not in Odessa. But this is all going on as part of this winter crisis. As seeing this, we got to secure Odessa. So let's go in. There's another group here that I'm going to highlight. The agent's code name was Vladimir Bodhiev. It's him in the middle with his two ladies. I think they really like this idea of treacherous femme fatales, like these fanatical Bolshevik women. And then you have these smirking girls, right? But really, this is a trope in a lot of the Romanian propaganda. He's actually sent from Moscow to take over an NKVD partisan group and a Rycom, cell, and performed sabotage, gathered intelligence, fairly successful. Once again, these guys aren't just like a paper tiger. They are doing some damage, right? There isn't just only the imagined partisan, Jewish partisan enemy. They're actually doing some stuff. But he gets captured in January 1942 while he's above ground meeting with his contact, right? He's betrayed by somebody, informed by somebody, and then the rest of the group underground is left without a leader and eventually surrender. So this is you can see the Romanian Guard, and they're guarding this group that's been captured. So as more and more the leaders are picked off above ground, like I say, the Romanians are having pretty good success above ground, dismantling the intelligence gathering.
Yeah.
But underground, there's still groups down there. The Romanians are so paranoid that they're like, we want to get in there and root these guys out. They aren't just going to leave them. So there's a general staff report on the 19th of January 1941 that they say, so far the catacombs have been bricked up, but the smoke company has now arrived. And with the help of a pioneer battalion, they're going to clear the catacombs, right? This is the game plan, right? We're going to actually clear the catacombs.
And how much of this, Grant, is a matter of pride now as well? I mean, there is this definite threat. There is this resistance element underground, but there is still a strong Romanian army presence above ground. They're outnumbered, clearly, these resistance. But surely, the more the weeks pass, the more this is becoming an issue of hubris, in a sense, and pride on the part that we must just deal with this. They've tried to deal with it. They've not been successful yet. So we've got to do something about it. It's just it's an ego thing to some extent.
Yeah, I think that's definitely, we can't take people's emotions out of this, right?
No.
There are irrational reasons for them to like go underground and try to root them out. But I mean, at the same time, the U.S. Army in Vietnam, they went after, Viet Cong hiding in tunnels, right? So there is legitimate like military sense. Then there's, pride and ego. Then there's the irrational fear of like, Jewish communists, just thousands of them,
as you
hundreds
said
of
at the
them.
beginning in your introduction, there's a lot of layers to this. There's a lots of layers. The religious nature of the country, the fears, rational and irrational, combining within Romania. You said 85% of people are kind of peasant. Probably so not ill-educated in some sense. There's lots of layers here to this to understand why things got the way they did, and it's an enthralling, if not a little bit disturbing, this presentation, but all the better for doing something hard-hitting. So I'll hand back to you.
And I want to like using this photo, right, that I have here. This is the opera schedule, right? This is a few months later in the summer, I'm pretty sure, or maybe even later, like might be from 43. But the Romanians at the same time, they want Odessa to be a safe, clean place full of art to show off how the Romanians are civilized and can spread civilization, like kind of almost like imperial, this aspirations, almost like being like the British or the French, like taking civilization to these benighted people. So they want the city, right? So you're talking about pride, right? There's your pride. They want the city to be safe enough that it can be demonstrated and shown off as like a jewel of like Romanian, culture. And so you can see like Madame Butterfly, right? Romania becomes well known. Odessa becomes well known as a great spot for, food, entertainment. German troops love going there, especially because the Germans don't do any of this. They starve the cities. They don't like hire local actors and spend money on theaters and stuff like that. Like the Romanians do. They still have a brutal regime, but in comparison to the Germans, like Odessa is like, it's like, and that is dependent on partisans not coming out and blowing up stuff.
Clearly, yes. That nothing like a bomb going off to spoil an opera. I always find, it's no, without being trite about it. But yeah, no, there's so many layers, so many things. This Odessa is one of those cities that it's got that kind of center, like Manila, like Singapore. It's that kind of center of trade, different cultures. Lots of history, lots of arts. It's a interesting.
Oh, it's gorgeous.
Right.
Yeah. So this smoke company is assigned to the 1st Fortification Brigade, which is a fancy term for basically a glorified construction unit. Basically like older reservists, old outdated guns, but they're the ones being assigned to do kind of coastal defense. And they're under right now General Nicolae T. Petrescu. And on the 6th of February, he actually complains about the smoke company, saying it can't be used in action in the catacombs because it's not equipped with the necessary material. He believes, quote, there's no need of gassing the catacombs, right? So at this point, the smoke company is preparing to adapt its equipment, right? It's kind of this is like every infantry company will have a couple like gas guys, chemical guys, mainly for popping off some smoke grenades or whatever. Yeah. This is a company of specially trained people who know how to mix chemicals and everything. And so, a lot of them for like big, obscuring targets from the air by like smoke. So they've been tinkering and trying to figure out the right mixtures. And this guy, Petrescu, is just fed up. He's like, we don't need the smoke. We need poison gas, right? So he's requesting, some kind of poison gas, not smoke. He wants more engineers, chemists, skilled in poison gas and their military use. He wants more equipment to pump gas into the catacombs, and he asked for help from the general staff to get Germans to provide specialists and materials, right, for this. Shortly thereafter, just 4 days later, he's replaced. I haven't figured out if this is because he asked for this, but he is replaced by a new general, Gheorghe Gheorghiu. on the 10th of February. So he's, Petrescu is like, he's pushing for gas, and but he leaves. So you have a new commander. The Germans do send a specialist, a man named Captain Pukala,
I guess. Yep.
I think. Is this Pukala, as I pronounce it? I'm not sure. That might just be a bad Romanian transliteration, but
could be. Yeah.
He arrives he gets an inspection on the 27th of February. He reports that there's been a reorganization of the partisans, that there seems, they identify like Bodhiev has, arrived, or some other people. He says they're using couriers and women. He estimates as many as 500 people in the catacombs. There had been another Romanian patrol and trying to get in, and with 3 deaths. They've been catching people above ground. He points out there's a big, well-armed group. There's a smaller group at Donlitskaya Street, which is, now we'll get back to this, Soldantenko, right? That he actually goes down there and sees the skull of like one of the women shot. And he says the partisans there had tried to escape, but they'd actually been stopped by the smoke. So the smoke company had actually prevented, after they've murdered Soldantenko, this guy who condemned them to eating human flesh, they decided they're going to try to escape. But the smoke companies start spewing smoke in there, which prevents them from escaping. And eventually, instead of escaping and maybe continuing to resist, they eventually just give up. They're just not worth it. So that's the end of that group. So there's one more big group that they're for sure of. And then they assume there's like maybe a third one we don't know about, right? There's just all this paranoia about just how many are down there, how many groups, what are they doing, who are they talking to. And so at the end of his report, he kind of gives some options. He's like, direct attack? No. Like, they can just shoot you up and hide, and it's terrible. He says maybe an indirect attack by smoke, or also a mixture of liquid acid chlorosulphurous and sulfur trioxide. These are chemicals that are meant to absorb, or even chemicals that are meant to absorb oxygen to suffocate the partisans, using zinc powder and heterochlorothine. I don't know if I pronounce those right, but he's like, these are heavier and will like sink down into because smoke tends to rise, right? He wants to, maybe we use these chemicals that are heavier than air, that will sink down and fill up. He's like, but if you there's a danger that the catacombs could explode if you just start pumping all these chemicals in there. And he's like, other chemical means are possible. I think this is code for poison gas. He's like, but we need permission from Berlin. He's like, in the meantime, continue walling up exits and looking, and finding more stuff. Trying to find more informants. But he does note, he's like, even the use of absorbing smoke chemicals, right, like zinc powder and heterochlorothane, he says, might be radioed to Moscow, and then they could claim the Germans are using poison gas against the Geneva Convention for propaganda purposes, even though basically it's chemical warfare, right? You start using those chemicals, maybe it's not mustard gas, right? But it's still, chemical warfare.
And this brings up this whole idea for those watching, Grant, is that we now know that in warfare in World War II, we're not counting the death camps and Zyklon B, but in warfare, gas, I think, maybe used chemical warfare, Japanese, Chinese theater a little bit, but in the battles we talk about, it was never used. That every GI, every Tommy, every Canadian soldier, every German soldier, every French soldier carried a gas mask through World War II. So everybody knows at an individual level in the army and at a higher level in the army, there is this ability to wage war, that every side possesses the technology. But there's a hesitancy on everyone's half, including the Third Reich, that once you do that, you're opening Pandora's box in the sense of how this war is going to escalate. So I'm not saying that it might not have been considered, but everyone knows that that's kind of a final last option, final option. So I can understand the fear of the Soviets finding out gas has been used could potentially ignite, the use of gas in World War II, which no one wants to think about that as an outcome. That's going to end badly, however it goes.
Yeah, that's what he specifically said. He's like, hey, they could use this as propaganda, then justify using gas against us. So I think it's really interesting, really important, right? That, there is this debate going on, and the Romanians are like gung ho at first, at least the local commander. The Germans definitely say no, and they say no to even these other chemicals, only smoke. The Romanians actually, General Steflia, the chief of staff, he comes in on the 28th and he says, keep walling up things, keep using the smoke company, tweaking your mixtures. But then he says, for the moment, an operation of gassing is not possible and not opportune. I think that's kind of understatement.
Political speak, if ever it was. Yeah.
And he then says German specialists will be arriving in Odessa with carbon dioxide, right? Because that was also something Petrescu had asked for. Hey, give me CO2, just pump CO2 down there. And they'd show up and they actually aren't specially trained troops and they don't have carbon dioxide. So the Germans even say no to that. Only smoke, right? We're only going to use smoke. We're not going to support anything else. And we'll give you some tips. That's it. So this is some of the equipment. We'll kind of go through this. The German captain says basically they're using the same equipment as the Germans. So there's like a smoke candle. This is something you could pop off, right? A lot of smoke, a little smoke grenade. And then he talks about smoke generators. I could not, for the life of me, find any examples even of a German smoke generator, but it would look something, this is an American, but it wouldn't something like this, that they would have basically taken some of the smoke candles and popped it into a generator, or like a bigger generator using something else like oil or something, and then try to direct it. And they literally were just trying to shoot these things down into the catacombs. And the German captain actually even recommends hey, find yourself a miner who knows the catacombs, who's been pulling stone up from underneath there and knows the air currents, so you can try to get the smoke as back as far as possible when you think you've identified a group. So this is kind of the equipment, and so we can move forward from here. So the kind of the main effort, right? It's kind of, you had some smoking in January, February, but then once it warms up, it starts warming up more. It's in March and April that the smoke company really gets going, and at the same time they have a lot more raids above ground. So they're and they're especially targeting Jews. I mean, there's a sweep between the 22nd and 30th March that gets 45 Jews, 84 unregistered former Soviet soldiers, and 390 locals without papers. Whether these people are actually partisans, not likely, but they're doing these raids above ground, and sometimes also getting, some of the intelligence groups. Below ground, they're tinkering, they're smoking, and they call it in a massive way by this point. And they're vigorously also any opening they find, putting under guard, bricking it up as well. On the 7th, 8th, and 9th of April, they start actually having people come out. The smoke is that bad. So they have the catacombs in Kuljalnik, which is actually north of Odessa. They have reports of people coming out of the catacombs trying to find food and stuff. So which is an impetus for them to continue these operations. Odessa Military Command, which had been dismantled after the explosion in August, is reestablished, and it kind of takes over this. He's under General Constantin Trastorianu, who's the photo in the upper right. And he's focused on deporting Jews and suspicious people and putting workers under close surveillance, plus pushing the smoke company to continue its operations. On the 14th of April, the 15th of April, the Germans report, to the Romanians, hey, we have no problem if you continue to use smoke in the catacombs, but we're not going to provide smoke units. We need them for the front. Which, the Romanians should read that as, they already know that things aren't going well. It's you can't even spare some smoke specialists. And the German commander, says, hey, you should use the smoke candles. I think they're better than the large smoke generators, because you can take those into the actual catacomb and set them off. Or the generators are big and bulky, and you can only get them a little bit in, and it's harder to use them. And this is the guy. This is actually a time where he says, like, find a knowledgeable miner, and you try to use the air currents. So here are like kind of these patronizing German instructions, like, oh yeah, use do those candles instead and get that money. Like, the Romanians didn't think about this already. I mean, it's kind of ridiculous. But I like this photo because you can see this is the opera house, looking towards the opera house there with a Romanian policeman. I don't know if this is 42, it might be 43, but this is, the city starts getting cleaned up, and life starts coming back. And this is a big part of why they're doing these operations. But the thing is, they're not, they've had some success, but they're also probably beginning to realize there's not as many partisans down there as they thought there were. And, they've arrested a lot of the people on top. There's actually some confusion in early May if maybe General Antonescu, or he's now Marshal Antonescu, had ordered a halt to it by saying, it's not worth it. So they're kind of like, wait, are we stopping? No, all right, let's resume our operations. There's actually on the 12th of May, they're during a smoking operation. This isn't just easy work. I mean, it's dangerous because once you get close to where the partisans are, if there are, when there are one. So in this group, a sergeant and another agent, I think policeman, are wounded by an explosion of a mine that had been placed at one of the entrances of the catacombs, and a second mine later exploded too. So there's booby traps, there's partisans who are still down there, so there are some casualties during this operation.
I mean, if you're close enough to put gas in from candles or smoke grenades, you're also close enough to be shot by the people there, if indeed there are people there. But just to spin it round a bit, you say exactly how many resistance are left below ground. How much of the fact, they are stopping the underground above ground, they're cutting out, they're arresting people, blah, blah, blah. There's also clearly this issue of food and because they have to come up to get supplies. They haven't got unlimited stuff down below. So how much of the gradual kind of reduction in number of the resistance below the ground is just due to time passing and hunger, and how much is due to this more aggressive policy of closing up entrances and putting the smoke inside? Or is it a combination of both?
It's unclear, but I would argue it's more just people getting sick and tired of being down there. The smoking operations have some effect, but they can, if the people have enough food and enough morale, they could stick down there. They can find places, but, I think grabbing and dismantling their intelligence, their information on top, is devastating. The smoke operations, I think, are kind of ambiguous in how effective they were. I mean, with the Soldatenko group, it definitely made them eventually surrender rather than be able to escape. But they might not have been able to escape anyway, So to me, it seems kind of like a vain exercise, and really that's what kind of the Romanians decide is, by the end of May and June, they start slackening off. People are leaving of their own free will because they're just starving or they're being betrayed. On the 17th of June, there's a report of 5 Jews being caught in Osotovko, right outside the city, and says they're in a state of physical or physiological misery and full of disease. They're called partisans, right? Even though I highly doubt they were. But it says that they sought to escape from inside because of a lack of food. And this really, so you have the partisans who are giving up, but there's also Jews who are been forced, right, who aren't partisans, who because of the repressions, because of the liquidation of the ghetto, the deportations, the death camps, basically, and the rest of Transnistria, they tried hiding out down there. And now these people, these are the ultimate last holdouts, right? The Jews who are going to, the partisans, they're, But like these Jews are even having to surrender, knowing that their fate is probably death, because they're going to be immediately identified as a partisan. Because, oh, you're Jewish and you were in a catacomb? Well, obviously, there's no other reason you'd be in a catacomb other than to be a partisan. And so it's news from the front. Obviously the war's going poorly. There's one group under a guy named Simon Lazarov, and his group basically has to eventually escape they manage to get out, from the catacombs, and they have to rely. It's only 3 guys by this point, and the rest had either already abandoned it, been arrested, killed, or they didn't know what happened to them. So out of a group of like a dozen or so, and so this last group of 3, they finally are like, okay, we got to try to get out too. We got to betray the motherland and give up. And they luckily found shelter with a family and lived in a hole dug in the basement for like several more years before, they could actually get out and start being partisans again. It's not until like 1944. So like that, the news from the front and demoralization, I think, plays a much bigger role than the actual smoke. I mean, the blocking up of entrances and taking informants and taking apart their intelligence, that's critical. The smoking, I think, is kind of smoke and mirrors.
Yeah. And we've got this clip here of the kind of the aftermath there. So it's about 3 minutes, or 2.5 minutes. So I'll let you kind of tell us what we're seeing here as well.
Right. So this is from a Romanian propaganda film reel, and they're focusing on that Soldantenko, that group that was in the city, rather than some of the groups. By this point, the groups are giving out are like outside of Odessa. And so they're talking about how they've blown up and they've, some of the buildings, that they mine some of the, entrances. This guy is, this is a piece of C4 that cleverly disguised in a glove, which I laughed. Some of this stuff might be like set up after the fact by the Romanian propagandists. But there were, booby traps. Whether, they were cleverly disguised in a glove, I don't know. And so this is showing some of those things. This is the interior of some of these catacombs, of what they kind of conditions are. They even got these, they did a reconstitution or reconstruction, it'd be in English. And these are the actual partisans that they're taking back down in there and said, reenact life, show us what it was like, and so we can film it. So this is where we fought off at the barricade and killed a couple Romanian soldiers when they tried to get in. This is what they're showing them. The Romanians probably brought in some extra rifles to make sure the partisans look really well equipped, but they were equipped. And so you have here, they're talking about supplies and how they're running out, you hear all the empty bottles, of food and conserves. And let's see what happens, an innocent cooking scene, but they turn the narration over these guys. They're like, oh yeah, act like you're there. It's like, oh, we're just cooking a meal. And their narration is like talking about the evil, bestial partisans who know no depths of depravity, and that the ferocity of the beasts, of the habits of savage and barbarian tribes, leading a subterranean life. And they also say, so here's, you can see the water. They have these nice wells. So these partisans are kind of actually showing yeah, this is life. And then the Remains are focusing, here's the corpses, here's the cannibalism, that's going on. And they claim that the brain of the victims was highly prized by the starving in the caves, right? There's just all this really kind of over the top. I mean, the cannibalism's real, but the Romanians really milk it. And they spread this, this is in Romanian and also in Russian and shown, and trying to dissuade people, don't go down the catacombs, don't become a partisan. You're just going to end up, a cannibal.
I mean, this is the point I was going to make to interrupt Grant, is that this is not just, we're not just looking at this event in isolation. We're looking at this as part of the Third Reich, their general need to suppress resistance movements, to tell people that if you do this, you will be punished. There will be a horrible outcome for yourself, for your families, for your friends. So this is, the propaganda images is they're fascinating to watch, but you have to understand that they are there to send a very clear message across the rest of the Third Reich at that time. There, this isn't as well known as perhaps the Warsaw Uprising. It isn't as well known as other events elsewhere, but that doesn't make it any less interesting. So we're coming to the end of things now. These are the color photos. And what are we looking at here exactly?
Yeah, so this is the current monument. There's a museum / monument / tourist trap of the part of the catacombs. None of the ones there's actually catacomb tours inside Odessa. The monument's outside Odessa. I think they wanted to avoid association with the Dolnitskaya street cannibals. So this was outside, where they knew there was no cannibals. And so I went there and toured it, and it's interesting because it's mainly kind of make-believe. They even admitted that, the real partisan stuff is really deeper in here, but they've recreated the barricade, and then people have carved the limestone because it's soft. It's a soft rock. They've carved it into these images of a partisan with a bayonet, or a partisan leader, the women supporting the partisans. They have these big hands in the bottom right holding a lantern, right? Talking about the importance of fuel oil, that this was the most important thing, right? So this is all stuff that was created basically for Soviet tourism, in the 60s and 70s and 80s, that they try to pass off. And so it's kind of interesting. They even had reenactors. So they had people dressed up, but they also had people dressed up as the criminals from the Tsarist era. So it's kind of this interesting.
Kind of going into those people dressed up at Checkpoint Charlie in Berlin, where history gets mixed up with theater and legend, and it all gets a bit confusing for the visitors. So sorry.
Yeah, sorry. And you talk about this as being unknown, but in Russia, A, the partisan movement is celebrated, and B, these partisans, these catacomb ones, are well known, in part because it was such a failure. It seems that after the war, they wanted to boost it up and pretend that everybody in Odessa was a brave resistor, especially because this was under the Romanians, which is kind of shameful, right? And Odessa actually didn't have that bad, right? When the Soviets show up, a lot of locals are kind of sad to see the Romanians leave because they're better than the Germans, and we don't really like the Soviet rule either, right? So they actually I think pump up the partisans' argument that we have to really pretend everybody in Odessa really was super dedicated. And it's interesting, kind of your other comment about the German, attitude toward these partisans. It's interesting that this is Romanians fairly independently. I mean, they control this area, and so it's kind of nature of the beast in some ways of some of these armies. I think there definitely is a feedback loop of the German depravity, and German manuals and fighting partisans are being translated and into Romanian. So they are definitely kind of giving an information dump on this. But the underlying assumption about Jews and partisans and military paranoia, I think that's innate to Romanians. That's independent of the Germans. But you build those things together.
And I think that's that idea. We know what happened to Romania post-war and communism and a pretty horrible regime. So because there's various ways of selling this story depending on your point of view, and I can completely understand the Soviet communist 50s, 60s. Look at this hardcore resistance unit that hanged around in these catacombs for months and months, and they were never really fully defeated. If it was time that defeated them. They were loyal, and everybody was in support of them. And then there's other ways of painting it as well, depending on what you're trying to get across. So with your work now, and we've got the slide on screen about your book coming out very shortly. Where Romania sits now, particularly where it sits, are people within Romania writing about World War II now? Where are they in their understanding of it? I mean, we talked with Chris Millington last week about where France is in understanding its history, and they've had sort of a long time to think about that. Where is Romania in terms of kind of placing itself within World War II from your kind of American point of view?
Well, from what I've seen is that they've kind of tried to rehabilitate the Eastern Front. I mean, Romania eventually switches sides, which a lot of people probably know.
Yeah.
And under communism, they celebrated the anti-fascist crusade. And after the fall of communism, they kind of just like rehabilitated the Holy War and like threw it together like, hey, we were double victims and we fought against communism and fascism, and communism was probably worse. You know, and so the war is like still seen as kind of heroic, as a doomed failure. Romanians today, though, also mostly believe they were reluctant allies of the Axis and enthusiastic members of the Allies, even though I argue kind of the reverse. Like they willingly joined the Axis and they were forced by being conquered and an armistice to provide troops for the Allies. The Holocaust is not well taught publicly. Like it's supposed to be taught, but it varies greatly. And most Romanians, if they know about the Holocaust, it's that it happened in Poland and the Germans did it. And if they know it happened in Romania, they blame it on the Germans occupying us, even though they weren't, and maybe a few bad eggs. You know, there is a neo-fascist kind of, right-winger groups that like even actually embrace, the old fascists and the old regime. Antonescu was for a time rehabilitated in the 90s. The Romanian government has done a great job and kind of after getting pressure in pushing back against that. There's a great scholarship in Holocaust studies. There's the Elie Wiesel Institute for the Study of Holocaust in Romania. Great Romanians both in there, and then also diaspora Romanians like Vladimir Solinari, Maria Bucur, other people like that who are writing in here in the States. There's good Romanian military history being produced. My problem with it is it's very operations focused, and a lot of it ignores kind of this greater context and what's going on in anti-partisan fighting and how mixed up with anti-Semitism that is. But there's a lot of new stuff coming out about the Romanian Air Force, but they're really great Romanian historians, but they kind of are focusing a lot on operations and technical aspects rather than why did we fight this war? What motivated us?
That would be my knowledge of Romania, is when the Romanian divisions are discussed as part of the defense of Stalingrad, for example. So there's no really attempt to understand why they're there, what their motivations are. It's in lists of units and say, oh, and the Romanian divisions. And that's kind of where my knowledge sits. And then, of course, as I said earlier, when we had the show about strategic bombing, the importance of the bombing of Romania later in the war. But really this complicated, because it is complicated, that, as you say, they did switch sides, and it seems that both sides and elements have kind of shifted blame, shifted responsibility, and said this wasn't really us, that was them, and this was us, but we were forced to do that. And it means that however you look at Romanian history, you're looking at it through someone's lens, and someone has put that lens there and is suggesting you look at it through a lens in a particular way. And it's perhaps taking someone like yourself now 70 plus years on to kind of pull it all apart and build it all up again and explain here are the stages of it. So to bring things to an end, what are your hopes for the book in terms of the kind of the World War II TV audience? It will obviously teach people about what was going in Romania, but hopefully bring a bit of context to where that fits into World War II generally. Is that kind of your aim?
Yeah, I mean, my book's not supposed to be super academic, technical. I mean, it's supposed to be it's academically rigorous, and I bring a lot of really good resources, stuff that hasn't been tapped, armies, official documents, but also like soldier diaries, memoirs, propaganda. Like some people talk about the propaganda, but they don't actually get into what the messaging was. And I think it's really important to see like is the propaganda these soldiers are consuming. I talk, but the main thing is kind of focusing on the motivation, putting the Romanian army in context. Because like you said, if all you know about the Romanians is that they get slaughtered at Stalingrad, and you're like, oh, I don't know why they're there. And then someone says, well, the Romanians are really reluctant. They really don't want to be there. They eventually switch sides. You're like, oh, okay, that makes sense. But
Yeah,
if you
you can
add in all
dismiss it
this
very easily, but it's actually more, as we said, there are more layers than that that need investigation. I think, again, it's reminding me that those of us watching this, there'll be Canadians watching this, Americans, British, we do all come at World War II from our interested in our own countries first, and then we look at our immediate neighbors and allies. So America extends their interest to Canada and the UK, and so do we. And actually, that constant reminder that World War II was a global war, everybody's involved on different levels of commitment, motivation, ideology, reasons, aspirations, and hopes post-war, I think, comes into things as well. This idea we said at the beginning of Romania kind of expanding its own territory, but separate to and not really directly part of what the Third Reich is trying to achieve, but again against this communism idea. And as we said, the word layers keeps coming to my mind. There's multiple layers to this story, and I wish you luck with your book, that people will give it a read and try and understand that it's complicated, but it's not inaccessible if someone breaks it all down to you. It seems complicated at the beginning, but like you've done tonight, you've walked us through this hand in hand, and we've come out of it learning a bit more about it. So I think we'll bring things to an end there. I mean, when the book comes out in November, I haven't got my theme week set out in October, November, but I'd love you to come back on and perhaps tackle another aspect, Romania later in the war or something else, because I think we could all do with learning a bit more about that country's involvement. So if you're happy to come back in, I don't know, November or December, that'd be really good. Although we will have Stalingrad week at some point, so you could come on and talk about the remains of Stalingrad and bust some myths on that. That would be good. So
I'd
anyway.
love to. Yeah, for sure. I'll accept any invitation, and I love nattering on about Romania.
Well, that's all good, because it's all new to me, and although certain parts of it kind of connect to other things in my brain there. But I'll just remind people what we've got coming up and come back and say goodbye in a few seconds. So yeah, our next show is Sunday. So we have the show about Japanese incarceration. So these are Japanese Americans incarcerated in the USA, which I know has been talked about before. But our guest who works at New Orleans World War II Museum, Steph Hinashit is going to come on and talk about it, and that'll be really good, and we'll learn more about that and the labor policies behind that. That'll be really good. And then we go on to the Spanish volunteers with the British Army and all sorts of things coming up after I go to Dieppe this weekend. So as usual, check out what we're doing on Patreon. Check out and pre-order Grant's book. That'll be good for you to learn something about Romania. And as always, just thank you for watching, everybody. So right now, it remains me to thank you very much, Grant, for joining us. And did you enjoy it?
Oh, I had a great time, and thanks everyone for watching.
Brilliant. Well, okay. Well, have a good weekend, everybody. I'll give you your good weekend, starting early for me because I'm off tomorrow morning. So thank you very much, everyone, for watching. This is Paul Woodadge for World War II TV. I will see you all again. Thank you very much.